The American Civil War, which took place from 1861 to 1865, was rooted in a complex array of social, economic, and political factors that had been building for decades. Leading up to the war, the United States was a deeply divided nation, with stark contrasts between the North and South in terms of industrial development, economic structures, and social ideologies. In the North, the economy was increasingly based on industrialization and wage labor, with a significant focus on manufacturing, commerce, and technology. Conversely, the Southern economy remained largely agrarian, heavily reliant on cotton production and the institution of slavery to maintain its agricultural dominance. This economic divergence created fundamental differences in how each region viewed national policies, especially regarding trade, tariffs, and the expansion of territories. Additionally, political disagreements heightened these regional divides. Northern states generally supported federal intervention in economic matters and favored policies that promoted infrastructure development, such as railroads and protective tariffs. In contrast, Southern states championed states' rights, advocating for minimal federal control over state affairs. They feared that policies enacted by a Northern-dominated federal government would threaten their way of life, including the continuation of slavery, which was central to the Southern economy. Cultural differences also played a significant role. The North was becoming increasingly influenced by abolitionist movements and a growing opposition to slavery, while the South continued to defend slavery as a cornerstone of their society and economy. This ideological divide was further exacerbated by the spread of abolitionist literature, debates over new territories, and the election of leaders like Abraham Lincoln, who openly opposed the expansion of slavery into new states. As tensions escalated, the South's perception of an imminent threat to their cultural and economic system led them to push for secession, ultimately resulting in the formation of the Confederate States of America. This conflict between two deeply opposing visions of what America should be, one rooted in free labor and industrialism, and the other in agrarianism and slavery, became the driving force behind the Civil War. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 marked a turning point in American history and served as a significant catalyst for the outbreak of the Civil War. Lincoln's victory was seen as a threat to the Southern way of life, particularly because of his stance on slavery and his party's platform advocating for the prevention of its expansion into new territories. While Lincoln himself did not initially call for the immediate abolition of slavery in the existing Southern states, his election deeply alarmed the Southern states, who feared that his administration would push for anti-slavery policies that would erode their social and economic systems. The Republican Party, of which Lincoln was a member, had been gaining momentum in the North, driven by growing concerns over the moral and economic implications of slavery. The North was becoming more industrialized and urbanized, while the South's economy remained dependent on the exploitation of enslaved labor. As a result, political power increasingly shifted in favor of Northern states, and with that shift came the fear among Southern leaders that their voices and interests were being marginalized. Lincoln's election in November 1860, without a single Southern electoral vote, was the final straw for many Southern states. Within months, states like South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas declared their secession from the Union, asserting that they had the right to withdraw from a federal government that no longer represented their interests. These states formed the Confederate States of America, solidifying their commitment to preserving slavery and state sovereignty over federal control. Lincoln, on the other hand, viewed secession as unconstitutional and firmly opposed the disunion of the United States. His election not only intensified sectional tensions, but also set the stage for the Union to take a firm stand against the dissolution of the nation. The political polarization of the era was perhaps epitomized by Lincoln's election, as his leadership was aimed at preserving the Union, maintaining federal authority, and eventually leading the fight to end slavery. Thus, Lincoln's presidency and the fears of Southern secession played a critical role in igniting the Civil War. The secession crisis that followed Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 was a defining moment in the history of the United States, as Southern states took drastic steps to withdraw from the Union. After Lincoln's victory, which did not carry a single Southern state's electoral vote, many Southern leaders felt that their interests were being disregarded and that their way of life, centered on slavery and states' rights, was under threat. This perception fueled their determination to assert independence from the federal government. The immediate response was the secession of South Carolina on December 20th, 1860, becoming the first state to formally leave the Union. Over the next few months, other Southern states followed suit, including Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states cited their right to self-determination, based on the belief that they had voluntarily joined the Union and thus had the power to withdraw from it when their interests were no longer protected. Secession was not a sudden or impulsive decision for the Southern states. Over the preceding years, tensions had been rising, particularly over the balance of power between free and slave states, the federal government's involvement in regional matters, and the spread of abolitionist movements. Southern leaders had long viewed the federal government as encroaching on their sovereignty, especially as Northern states increasingly supported policies aimed at restricting the expansion of slavery. The election of a Republican president like Lincoln, who was committed to ending the spread of slavery, pushed these fears to a breaking point. Once secession began, the Confederacy moved quickly to solidify its independence, establishing a government led by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The idea was to create a new nation that upheld the Southern way of life, centered around states' rights and the preservation of slavery. In response, the federal government under Lincoln was faced with the challenge of either allowing the South to secede peacefully or preserving the Union by force if necessary. The secession crisis laid bare the deep divisions within the United States and marked a decisive turning point toward war. While some hoped for a peaceful resolution, both sides understood that the survival of the Union was at stake, leading to a conflict that would soon engulf the nation in a devastating civil war. The first battle of the American Civil War, fought at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861, is a pivotal moment that symbolized the beginning of open conflict between the North and South. The attack on Fort Sumter marked the official start of the war and set the stage for 4 years of intense struggle and bloodshed that would test the very foundation of the United States. Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, was a Union stronghold in Confederate territory. After South Carolina's secession from the Union in December 1860, Confederate forces, led by Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, surrounded the fort, demanding its surrender. Major Robert Anderson, commanding the Union troops stationed at Fort Sumter, refused to abandon the fort, standing firm in his commitment to maintain federal control. The standoff between Union and Confederate forces intensified as the Confederate government, under President Jefferson Davis, sought to assert its authority over the newly seceded Southern states. On April 12th, Confederate artillery opened fire on the fort, igniting the conflict. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours, with Fort Sumter sustaining significant damage. Major Anderson's small garrison eventually surrendered on April 14th, marking the first military defeat for the Union. The fall of Fort Sumter had profound national implications. It unified the North in its resolve to preserve the Union, with many Northern states quickly mobilizing troops and resources to fight the Southern secessionists. President Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months, seeking to suppress the rebellion and restore order to the Union. For the South, the victory at Fort Sumter was a symbolic triumph and a validation of their move toward independence. However, it also signaled the beginning of a costly war that would stretch the Confederacy to its limits, as the Union quickly gathered momentum in the ensuing battles. Fort Sumter became a symbol of the divided nation, where political and cultural differences over slavery, states' rights, and federal power escalated into open conflict. The battle marked the transition from political discourse to full-scale war, shaping the course of the American Civil War that would follow. The American Civil War was fundamentally a conflict between the Union, representing the Northern states, and the Confederacy, composed of the Southern states that had seceded from the Union. At its core, the war was driven by stark differences in ideology, economy, politics, and social structures, particularly revolving around the issue of slavery and the power of federal authority versus states' rights. The Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln and supported by the free states in the North and West, sought to preserve the United States as a single, unified nation. The Union believed in a strong federal government that had the authority to regulate and enforce policies across all states, including the abolition of slavery and the preservation of national unity. Northern states were largely industrialized and urbanized, with economies based on manufacturing, trade, and wage labor. The Union also had superior infrastructure, a larger population, and more industrial resources, which gave it a significant advantage in terms of manpower and logistics. In contrast, the Confederacy fought to establish an independent nation where states had the autonomy to govern themselves, especially in matters of slavery and economic policies. The Southern economy was agrarian, heavily dependent on cotton and agricultural exports, and required a system of slave labor to sustain its plantation economy. Southern leaders argued that states had the right to govern themselves and resist federal interference, particularly in decisions surrounding slavery. For the Confederacy, secession was not only a political move but a preservation of their way of life, which was deeply tied to their social hierarchy and economic structure. Throughout the war, these differing visions of the United States created a deep rift, with each side committed to protecting its distinct identity. The Union pursued policies that sought to suppress the Confederacy militarily, economically, and politically. They implemented strategies like the Anaconda Plan, which aimed to block Southern ports and restrict trade, thereby weakening the Confederacy's economy and ability to sustain the war effort. Meanwhile, the Confederacy relied on strong leadership, such as that of General Robert E. Lee and other prominent Southern generals, to lead a determined and resilient fight against what they saw as an aggressive Northern invasion. The Union's focus on maintaining a unified nation and eradicating slavery ultimately became the moral imperative of the war. On the other hand, the Confederacy's commitment to independence and self-governance drove their military and political strategies, despite the severe disadvantages they faced in terms of resources and manpower. The battle between these two opposing visions for the future of the United States came to define the conflict and left a lasting legacy on the nation's history. The American Civil War saw numerous battles that shaped its course and ultimately determined the outcome of the conflict. These battles were not only military engagements but also moments of deep significance for both the Union and the Confederacy, each reflecting their strategies, sacrifices, and determination to achieve victory. From early skirmishes to decisive turning points, these key battles played a critical role in shaping the trajectory of the war. One of the earliest and most significant battles was the First Battle of Bull Run, fought in July 1861. Taking place near Manassas, Virginia, it was the first major clash between Union and Confederate forces. Despite initial Union optimism for a swift victory, the Confederacy emerged victorious, demonstrating the resolve of Southern troops and foreshadowing a long and grueling war. The outcome shocked the North, dispelling the notion that the conflict would be short-lived and emphasizing the need for a more substantial military effort. Another crucial battle came at Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862. Known as the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, Antietam ended in a strategic Union victory that allowed President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared the freedom of all slaves in Confederate territories, shifting the war's focus toward the abolition of slavery and rallying international support for the Union cause. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, stands as a turning point in the war. Union forces, led by General George Meade, repelled Confederate troops under General Robert E. Lee's command, marking the first major defeat for the South in a battle on Northern soil. The Union victory at Gettysburg halted Lee's invasion of the North and demonstrated the effectiveness of superior manpower and logistics in the Union Army. The Siege of Vicksburg, occurring between May and July 1863, was another pivotal moment. The Union's success in capturing Vicksburg split the Confederacy in two along the Mississippi River, cutting off Southern supply lines and military communications. The defeat at Vicksburg, coupled with the defeat at Gettysburg, effectively ended any real hope of Southern victory, as the Confederacy struggled to recover from these substantial losses. The Battle of Chattanooga, fought in November 1863, further solidified Union control over the western theater of the war. Union forces, under General Ulysses S. Grant, succeeded in defeating Confederate forces and securing control of a vital supply route, the Tennessee River. This victory enabled the Union to push deeper into the South and pave the way for subsequent campaigns. Throughout the Civil War, these key battles underscored the resilience and tactical ingenuity of both sides. The sacrifices made in these engagements shaped the outcome of the war and left lasting impacts on the nation's memory of the conflict. The victories and defeats were critical in illustrating the relentless struggle between the Union and the Confederacy, ultimately shaping the course of history. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, was one of the most significant turning points of the American Civil War and a defining moment in the nation's history. This executive order declared the freedom of all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory, fundamentally altering the purpose of the war and reshaping the moral and political landscape of the United States. Leading up to the proclamation, the Civil War had been largely viewed as a struggle to preserve the Union, with some attempts to minimize the issue of slavery to prevent alienating border states and Northern Democrats who were opposed to ending slavery entirely. However, as the war progressed and the Union faced countless battles with significant casualties, President Lincoln recognized that merely preserving the Union would not resolve the deep-seated issues that caused the conflict. He saw slavery as a root cause of the war, and in order to achieve a lasting peace and a united nation, it became necessary to confront the institution directly. The turning point came after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. Though it ended in a tactical draw, the Union's strategic position provided Lincoln with the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This document declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in Confederate states still in rebellion against the Union would be forever free. While the proclamation did not apply to border states that had remained loyal to the Union, nor did it immediately free all enslaved people, its symbolic and legal significance was monumental. The Emancipation Proclamation served multiple purposes. First, it shifted the war's focus from simply reuniting the nation to actively ending the institution of slavery. This not only aligned the Union's moral cause with the abolitionist movement, but also gained support from anti-slavery groups, both domestically and internationally. Secondly, it allowed the Union to recruit African American troops into the Army, which became crucial for the Union's eventual success. African American soldiers played a significant role in key battles, such as the 54th Massachusetts Regiment's brave charge at Fort Wagner. Moreover, the proclamation undermined the Confederate war effort by depriving them of essential labor and weakening their ability to sustain their war economy. It also discouraged foreign powers like Britain and France from intervening on behalf of the South, as their anti-slavery sentiments aligned with the Union's cause. Despite its symbolic power, enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation was limited to Confederate-held territory. Many Southern states ignored the order entirely, continuing to perpetuate slavery. However, it marked a crucial shift in the war's trajectory, making the abolition of slavery a central goal for the North. Over time, as Union forces advanced through Southern territories, the proclamation became more fully realized, ultimately leading to the complete abolition of slavery with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. In sum, the Emancipation Proclamation was a watershed moment in American history, transforming the Civil War into a fight not only for national unity, but also for freedom and justice. It solidified Lincoln's legacy as a president who sought to redefine the United States as a land of liberty and equality, forever altering the nation's trajectory toward a more inclusive and just future. The contribution of African American troops during the American Civil War was one of the most significant and transformative aspects of the conflict. Enslaved African Americans and freed black men from both the North and South played a crucial role in supporting the Union war effort, proving their bravery, dedication, and resilience on the battlefield. Their participation not only helped secure Union victories, but also challenged entrenched notions of race and slavery in America, paving the way for the broader civil rights movements that would follow. Initially, African Americans were barred from serving in the U.S. Army. However, as the war progressed and Union forces struggled to maintain their manpower, the need for additional soldiers became increasingly urgent. Recognizing this, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which explicitly allowed African American men to enlist in the Union Army. This marked a significant turning point, as it officially integrated black soldiers into the fight to preserve the Union and abolish slavery. The recruitment of African American soldiers was met with resistance and skepticism, both within the military and society at large. Many white officers were hesitant to trust black troops and doubted their ability to fight effectively. Despite these challenges, African American soldiers, many of whom were formerly enslaved, proved themselves in battle, demonstrating extraordinary valor and determination in the face of adversity. One of the most famous and impactful units of African American soldiers was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. This regiment became renowned for their courageous assault on Fort Wagner in 1863, where they faced overwhelming Confederate forces and endured heavy casualties. Their bravery helped change perceptions of African American soldiers, leading to increased enlistment and respect for black troops throughout the Union Army. African American soldiers made significant contributions across numerous battles, from the bloody fields of Antietam to the fierce confrontations at Petersburg and Richmond. Beyond their role as fighters, black troops also served as laborers, medics, and spies, playing a variety of essential roles that supported the Union war effort. They helped disrupt Confederate supply lines, gather intelligence, and provide critical manpower in the construction of fortifications and transportation routes. The presence of African American soldiers not only bolstered the Union's fighting forces, but also helped shift the narrative of racial equality during and after the war. Their service highlighted the hypocrisy of a nation fighting for freedom while denying it to millions of black Americans. This challenge to the status quo fueled the momentum for civil rights and emancipation, laying the groundwork for the future struggle for equality. Moreover, the legacy of African American soldiers continued to grow in importance beyond the war. Their sacrifices were memorialized in history, inspiring future generations to fight for civil rights and social justice. Through their perseverance and determination, African American troops played a pivotal role in reshaping the United States, making undeniable contributions to the ultimate victory of the Union and the eventual abolition of slavery. General Ulysses S. Grant played a pivotal role in the Union's victory during the American Civil War, serving as the supreme commander of the Union Army and one of the most effective military leaders of the conflict. His strategic brilliance, determination, and ability to maintain the morale and discipline of his troops ultimately secured Union dominance over the Confederacy. Throughout the war, Grant's leadership was instrumental in turning the tide of the conflict, ultimately leading to the defeat of the Confederacy and the preservation of the United States. Grant's military career before the Civil War had been modest, with limited success in earlier engagements. However, during the war, he quickly emerged as a leader who understood the importance of relentless pursuit, sustained pressure, and adaptability on the battlefield. One of his most notable attributes was his ability to learn from his mistakes and refine his strategies over time, allowing him to outmaneuver Confederate forces in some of the war's most critical battles. Initially, Grant led Union forces in the Western Theater, achieving significant victories in battles such as Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in 1862. His success at these early engagements demonstrated his ability to capture key strategic points, giving the Union control of important rivers and railroads. One of his most defining moments came during the Siege of Vicksburg in 1863. By carefully surrounding the city and cutting off its supply lines, Grant's forces achieved a decisive victory, splitting the Confederacy in two along the Mississippi River. This victory not only boosted Union morale, but also dealt a crippling blow to Confederate military capabilities. Grant's leadership extended beyond battlefield tactics. He maintained strong communication with other Union generals, such as General William Tecumseh Sherman and General Philip Sheridan, coordinating multi-theater offensives that overwhelmed Confederate forces in multiple regions. This collaboration ensured that the Union maintained a strategic advantage on all fronts, effectively suffocating the Confederacy's ability to wage war. Unlike earlier Union generals who sought decisive battles or limited engagement, Grant adopted a more aggressive and persistent approach. His strategy of total war, which targeted both military and civilian infrastructure in the South, sought to cripple the Confederacy's ability to sustain the war. His use of this strategy was epitomized in the 1864 Overland Campaign, which saw a series of brutal clashes between Union and Confederate forces. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, Grant relentlessly pushed forward, refusing to give up ground, while ensuring that his forces were constantly supplied and reinforced. Grant's leadership culminated in his appointment as the Supreme Commander of all Union forces in 1864. His strategic vision and dedication to victory were evident in his relentless pursuit of Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee, culminating in the decisive Battle of Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. It was here that Lee formally surrendered, effectively ending the war and cementing Grant's reputation as one of the most important figures in American military history. Beyond his military achievements, Grant's legacy extended into his role as the 18th President of the United States, where he sought to address the post-war challenges of Reconstruction and racial equality. His leadership during the Civil War was crucial in shaping the Union's success, demonstrating the importance of unity, perseverance, and strategic innovation in times of conflict. The American Civil War, lasting from 1861 to 1865, had a profound and lasting impact on the United States, shaping the nation's political, social, and economic landscape in ways that are still felt today. From the abolition of slavery to the transformation of the federal government's role, the war left an indelible mark on the nation's history, laying the groundwork for the modern United States. One of the most significant outcomes of the Civil War was the abolition of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, paved the way for the eventual passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States. This monumental achievement dismantled the institution that had long defined the economic and social fabric of the Southern states, freeing millions of African Americans from bondage. While the emancipation of slaves did not lead immediately to racial equality, it was a crucial first step toward a more just and equitable society. The Civil War also marked a shift in the balance of power between the states and the federal government. Before the war, states enjoyed significant autonomy, with the notion that they had the right to govern themselves, including the ability to secede from the Union. However, the war reaffirmed the authority of the federal government, particularly under President Lincoln's leadership, setting a precedent for a stronger national government. This shift laid the groundwork for federal policies addressing civil rights, social justice, and economic regulation in the years that followed. Economically, the war had transformative effects, particularly in the South. The destruction caused by years of conflict devastated Southern infrastructure, agriculture, and industry. The abolition of slavery eliminated the primary labor system, forcing the South to rebuild its economy with a newfound dependence on free labor and wage-based systems. Meanwhile, the North's industrial and financial infrastructure thrived, cementing the dominance of the Northern economy in the post-war period. Socially, the Civil War prompted a re-evaluation of American identity and the place of African Americans in society. While the war did not fully dismantle systemic racism, it laid the groundwork for civil rights movements later in the 20th century. The experience of African American soldiers, both in battle and in supporting roles, challenged stereotypes and demonstrated the ability of Black Americans to contribute to the national cause, eventually leading to increased calls for equality and civil rights advancements. The Civil War also influenced future military strategy and tactics. The emphasis on total war, whereby military operations extended beyond the battlefield to include economic and psychological warfare, shaped modern warfare practices. The lessons learned from the extensive use of railroads, logistics, and innovative battlefield tactics continued to influence military training and operations in the 20th century. Politically, the aftermath of the war ushered in a period of Reconstruction, a time of immense struggle to rebuild the nation and integrate freed slaves into American society. The Reconstruction era saw the passage of critical amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which addressed issues of citizenship, equal protection under the law, and voting rights for African Americans. However, the complexities and resistance to these changes highlighted the long journey toward equality and civil rights, leading to a series of compromises, setbacks, and subsequent struggles. In sum, the Civil War had a profound and lasting impact on American society. It redefined the nation's values, governance, economy, and social structures. While the war healed many divisions, it left an enduring legacy of resilience, reform, and ongoing efforts toward equality, which continue to shape the United States to this day. The American Civil War had a significant and transformative impact on women, as they played a variety of crucial roles in supporting the Union and Confederate efforts. Traditionally, women had been confined to domestic roles, but the war shattered many of these limitations, allowing them to contribute in ways previously unimagined. From nursing and fundraising to espionage and managing households, women became essential to both the war effort and the broader societal shifts that followed. One of the most prominent roles women assumed during the Civil War was that of nurses. With thousands of soldiers wounded and dying on the battlefield and in makeshift hospitals, the demand for medical care far exceeded the supply. Women such as Clara Barton, Harriet Tubman, and Dorothea Dix emerged as key figures in providing care to the sick and injured. Clara Barton, known as the Angel of the Battlefield, played a crucial role in organizing and leading relief efforts, often going beyond the boundaries of military protocol to assist wounded soldiers. Similarly, Harriet Tubman, who had previously escaped slavery, served as a nurse and spy for the Union Army, providing intelligence and helping to guide escaped slaves to safety. In addition to medical care, women were deeply involved in fundraising and providing supplies to soldiers. Union women established numerous aid societies and charitable organizations to raise funds for supplies like clothing, food, and medicine. Women like Mary Todd Lincoln, who led efforts to provide comfort to wounded soldiers, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose writing helped galvanize public support for the abolitionist cause, became prominent figures in these initiatives. On the Confederate side, women formed sewing circles and other organizations to create clothing, bandages, and other materials to support the war effort. Women also became integral to espionage and intelligence gathering. With men fighting on the front lines, women were often tasked with gathering sensitive information, delivering messages, and acting as couriers. Women such as Belle Boyd and Rose O'Neal Greenough became famous for their daring espionage activities, providing valuable intelligence that influenced key military decisions. Their roles demonstrated that women could play a strategic and impactful role in wartime, far beyond traditional domestic duties. Moreover, many women managed farms, businesses, and households in the absence of their male family members. With vast numbers of men either enlisted or injured, women became the sole breadwinners for many families. This experience empowered women to take on roles of leadership and independence, forcing a redefinition of gender roles in post-war America. The Civil War provided a unique opportunity for women to break out of the confines of traditional expectations and assert themselves in public and professional spaces. The war also led to the increased recognition of women's contributions, particularly through organizations such as the Women's Relief Corps, which was established after the war to continue assisting veterans and their families. Additionally, the work of women during the Civil War laid the groundwork for future movements advocating for women's suffrage and broader social equality. In sum, the Civil War was a transformative period for women in America as they actively engaged in roles that extended far beyond the domestic sphere. Their involvement in healthcare, espionage, administration, and support for families not only showcased their resilience and capability, but also laid the foundation for greater societal recognition and equality in the post-war era. The Reconstruction period, which followed the American Civil War from 1865 to 1877, was a transformative yet deeply complex era in U.S. history. It was marked by the challenge of rebuilding the South, integrating millions of freed slaves into society and redefining the political and social structure of the United States. However, it was also a time of intense struggle for civil rights, as newly emancipated African Americans sought to secure their place as full citizens with equal rights, leading to significant political and social upheaval. After the Civil War, the primary goal of Reconstruction was to reintegrate the Southern states back into the Union while ensuring the protection of the newly freed African American population. However, achieving these objectives was far from straightforward. The Southern states, devastated economically and socially, faced immense resistance to change. At the same time, Northern politicians and leaders struggled to implement policies that could effectively address the issues of racial equality, voting rights, and economic opportunities. One of the most significant efforts of Reconstruction was the passage of 3 constitutional amendments: the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, marking a monumental step toward racial freedom. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law and defined citizenship, while the 15th Amendment secured the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous servitude. These amendments were intended to ensure that African Americans were treated as full citizens with the rights and protections afforded to all Americans. Despite these legal advancements, the practical application of civil rights during Reconstruction was fraught with challenges. Many Southern states resisted integration, implementing black codes and other discriminatory laws designed to limit the freedoms of freedmen. These laws restricted employment opportunities, criminalized vagrancy, and restricted social freedoms, essentially trying to reinstate a form of racial subjugation under new forms of control. Additionally, political power for African Americans during Reconstruction was hard to sustain. In states such as South Carolina, African Americans held significant political office, including positions in the state legislature and even governor's office. However, the rise of white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and the systematic disenfranchisement of African American voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory practices led to the gradual erosion of their political influence. The Compromise of 1877, which resulted in the end of federal military occupation in the South, symbolized the collapse of Reconstruction. With the withdrawal of Northern troops, Southern Democrats regained control of state governments, leading to the establishment of the Jim Crow era, an era marked by widespread racial segregation and systemic discrimination that would persist for nearly a century. Despite the failures of Reconstruction, the era laid the groundwork for future civil rights activism. The establishment of institutions such as historically black colleges and the development of African American political organizations continued to push for social and political equality. Landmark Supreme Court decisions like Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 further entrenched racial segregation, but the seeds of resistance were already being planted through grassroots movements and advocacy for equality. In summary, Reconstruction was a critical but turbulent period in American history, characterized by both significant strides towards civil rights and persistent obstacles to true equality. While it failed to fully realize the vision of an integrated and equal society, it set the stage for future movements and legislation that would eventually dismantle racial segregation and promote civil rights on a broader scale. The American Civil War had a profound and lasting impact on Southern society, reshaping its economy, culture, and social structure in ways that were both transformative and tumultuous. The defeat of the Confederacy left the South devastated, both physically and emotionally, as the region grappled with the loss of its primary institution, slavery, and the need to rebuild amidst the challenges of economic and social change. One of the most immediate and impactful changes in Southern society was the abolition of slavery. The war brought an end to the institution that had been central to the economic, social, and political life of the South for over 2 centuries. With the Emancipation Proclamation and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, African Americans were freed from bondage, drastically altering the South's labor system. Plantation economies that had relied on enslaved labor were left without a viable replacement, forcing many landowners to rethink their agricultural practices. The transition from a system based on forced labor to one based on free labor was painful and gradual, as former slaves faced systemic discrimination, poverty, and limited economic opportunities. Economically, the South struggled to adapt to the changes brought by the war. Southern infrastructure, such as railroads, bridges, and cities, was heavily damaged during the conflict. The agricultural economy, which had been predominantly cotton-based, found itself dependent on new labor systems that were unstable and often exploitative. Tenant farming and sharecropping emerged as primary means of sustenance for many freedmen and poor whites, creating a cycle of debt and poverty. This economic inequality reinforced the social divisions between former slaveholders and their former slaves, deepening the economic disparities that would persist for generations. Socially, the Civil War exposed deep rifts within Southern society. Southern pride in their Confederate heritage created lasting divisions, with many Southerners clinging to the ideals of the lost cause. This mindset romanticized the Confederacy and its leaders while perpetuating myths about the justness of slavery and the inevitability of the South's defeat. This cultural legacy influenced Southern schools, institutions, and memorials, shaping how future generations understood the Civil War and its aftermath. Additionally, the Reconstruction period saw fierce resistance from white Southerners against integration and civil rights for African Americans. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups sought to undermine Reconstruction efforts by using violence, intimidation, and disenfranchisement to maintain control over African American populations. This led to a rollback of civil rights advancements, setting back efforts toward racial equality in the South for decades. The psychological and emotional scars left by the war also had lasting effects on Southern society. The loss of life and destruction of communities created a sense of trauma, with many Southerners unable to reconcile the defeat and humiliation of their cause. Confederate monuments, memorials, and the perpetuation of Confederate ideology were efforts to preserve a sense of identity and honor in a region that faced economic and social ruin. Despite these struggles, Southern society began to slowly transform in the years following the war. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, rooted in the same ideals that drove Reconstruction, challenged the deeply entrenched racial inequalities and called for systemic change. Ultimately, the Civil War and its aftermath forced the South to confront its history, rethinking its identity and the injustices that had defined it for so long. While full reconciliation would take generations, the Civil War planted the seeds for ongoing struggles toward a more equitable and unified nation. The American Civil War had profound and lasting effects on the economic landscape of the United States, both in the short term and long term. The conflict reshaped the economies of the North, South, and eventually the entire nation, as the war created significant disruptions to established economic systems, catalyzed industrial growth, and accelerated the transition from an agrarian to a more industrialized society. These changes had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the end of the war. In the North, the war provided a substantial boost to industrialization and technological advancement. The Union's economy had been primarily driven by manufacturing, commerce, and finance, and the war effort further expanded these sectors. The demand for weapons, ammunition, transportation, and other supplies spurred rapid industrial growth, as factories and railroads became essential to supporting the war effort. Innovations in technology, such as the introduction of advanced weaponry, telegraphs, and steam engines, became commonplace, laying the foundation for modern industrial practices. The North's economic infrastructure, particularly its banking system, flourished during the war. With rising government spending on military supplies, the Union relied heavily on the issuance of bonds and the establishment of a national currency, which was vital for financing the war. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 helped stabilize the financial system by creating a uniform currency and establishing a system of federal banks. This federal control helped unify the Northern economy, making it more resilient and interconnected. In contrast, the Southern economy suffered immensely during the Civil War. The South's agrarian economy, which had been based on large plantations and slave labor, was devastated by the conflict. With the abolition of slavery and the disruption of labor systems, Southern agriculture struggled to recover. The loss of essential labor and the destruction of infrastructure, including railroads and farmland, left the South impoverished. Without the economic backbone provided by slavery, the South found itself unable to adapt quickly to a new, free labor economy, creating long-term economic stagnation that persisted well into the 20th century. Moreover, the war led to the collapse of Southern financial institutions. With the Confederacy's failure, Confederate currency became worthless, leaving Southern banks unable to provide economic stability. Many Southern states, unable to access Northern credit markets, were left to rebuild from the ground up with little access to capital. This economic hardship created a power imbalance, with the North maintaining a greater advantage in terms of industrial development, infrastructure, and overall economic growth. The shift from an agrarian economy to a more industrial and centralized economy was one of the most significant long-term changes resulting from the Civil War. As the war drew to a close, the need for a more modern economy became evident. The South, however, continued to lag behind in terms of industrialization, relying largely on agricultural production with limited diversification into manufacturing and commerce. Northern industrial dominance became further entrenched in the post-war era as the country underwent an economic transformation that saw the rise of factories, urban centers, and a growing middle class. Additionally, the war set the stage for increased federal involvement in the economy, as the government played a more active role in regulating markets, managing resources, and overseeing national economic policies. The establishment of institutions such as the Department of Agriculture and the eventual formation of regulatory agencies marked a shift toward a more interventionist economic system aimed at promoting stability and economic growth. In summary, the Civil War had a lasting impact on the economic trajectory of the United States. The North's industrial growth, combined with a more unified financial system, placed the country on a path toward greater economic integration. Conversely, the South faced long-term challenges, struggling to transition from a slave-based economy to a free labor system while dealing with infrastructure destruction and economic underdevelopment. The economic aftermath of the Civil War continued to shape the nation's development well into the 20th century. The American Civil War had a profound and lasting impact on the nation's identity and unity. Prior to the war, the United States was a collection of states with varying degrees of autonomy, each with its own cultural, economic, and political distinctiveness. However, the conflict between the Union and the Confederacy forced a re-evaluation of what it meant to be an American, ultimately reshaping the collective identity of the nation and solidifying the idea of a unified United States. At the core of the Civil War was the struggle over the concept of states' rights versus a stronger centralized federal government. The South's desire to maintain its sovereignty, especially in relation to the institution of slavery, clashed with the Union's belief in a more unified nation where federal authority took precedence. The war tested the very definition of American democracy and challenged the notion of how much power individual states should hold in relation to the national government. The war forced the North to grapple with the moral imperatives of preserving the Union while also addressing the issue of slavery. Abraham Lincoln's leadership during the war emphasized not only the preservation of the Union, but also the idea that the United States was a single, indivisible entity. Through speeches like the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln redefined the purpose of the Union effort, emphasizing that the war was not just a fight for political preservation, but for the moral and ethical ideals upon which the nation was founded. In the aftermath of the war, the North emerged more firmly committed to the idea of a single, united nation. The South, however, continued to grapple with its place within this unified identity. The South's defeat and the subsequent imposition of Reconstruction policies were seen by many Southerners as humiliating and unjust, fostering a sense of regionalism and resentment toward the federal government. This regional identity, rooted in Confederate heritage and a desire for states' rights, persisted for decades after the war, shaping how the South viewed itself in contrast to the North. Despite this regional tension, the Civil War ultimately reinforced the idea that the United States was a singular entity, bound by shared history, values, and a commitment to liberty and equality. The sacrifices made during the war, whether by soldiers, civilians, or leaders, fostered a sense of collective national identity that extended beyond individual states and regions. This notion of unity became even more pronounced during moments of national crisis, as Americans, regardless of region, rallied around the shared ideals of freedom and democracy. The Civil War also helped reshape the relationship between the government and its citizens. The war era saw the expansion of federal power, especially in the areas of civil rights, economic regulation, and social governance. This shift towards federal authority was instrumental in creating a more unified national identity that transcended localism, regionalism, and even partisan politics. Furthermore, the Civil War and its aftermath challenged the concept of American exceptionalism, fostering a broader understanding of what it means to be American. Issues of race, citizenship, and rights were no longer confined to the individual states. Freed African Americans, who had long been excluded from the national conversation, became a significant part of the national identity through the struggle for equality and civil rights. The fight for racial equality in the post-war era expanded the understanding of American identity to include all citizens, regardless of race, ethnicity, or social status. In sum, the Civil War played a crucial role in shaping the American national identity. It shifted the balance of power between states and the federal government, challenged regional identities, and fostered a more unified vision of the nation. Although the conflict left deep scars, it laid the foundation for a stronger, more cohesive United States, with a deeper sense of shared purpose and mutual responsibility. The war's legacy of unity and national identity continues to resonate in the country's political, social, and cultural fabric today. The American Civil War was not only a conflict of ideals, but also a period of significant innovation in military tactics and technology. Both the Union and the Confederacy sought ways to outmaneuver and defeat their opponents, leading to the development and refinement of new military strategies, weaponry, and logistical systems. From advancements in weaponry to changes in battlefield tactics, the Civil War represented a turning point in the evolution of modern warfare. One of the most significant advancements during the Civil War was in the realm of weaponry. The introduction of rifled muskets and repeat-fire weapons, such as the Spencer carbine, revolutionized battlefield tactics. Unlike smoothbore muskets used in earlier conflicts, rifled muskets had spiral grooves that improved accuracy and range. This made it possible for soldiers to hit targets at longer distances with greater precision, fundamentally altering how battles were fought. Additionally, artillery saw advancements with the use of more effective cannons and the introduction of ironclad warships, such as the USS Monitor and CSS Virginia, which changed naval warfare by making traditional wooden ships obsolete. The use of the railroads was another critical innovation during the Civil War. Railroads allowed for the rapid movement of troops, supplies, and equipment across vast distances, which was unprecedented in the 19th century. This enabled the Union to transport large armies and maintain supply lines, while the Confederacy struggled to keep up due to their limited infrastructure. The efficient use of rail networks played a decisive role in Union military success, particularly during campaigns such as General Sherman's March to the Sea. In terms of strategy, the concept of total war emerged during the Civil War. Leaders like General Ulysses S. Grant and General William Tecumseh Sherman employed tactics that targeted not only enemy troops, but also the economic and civilian resources that supported the war effort. Sherman's scorched earth approach during his campaign through Georgia demonstrated how destruction of infrastructure, farms, and towns could cripple the enemy's ability to sustain its forces. This shift marked a more aggressive and comprehensive approach to warfare, one that moved beyond traditional battlefield engagements and sought to disrupt an enemy's entire social and economic structure. The Civil War also introduced the use of military reconnaissance and intelligence in new ways. The Union and Confederate armies relied heavily on spies, signal corps, and telegraphs to gather real-time information about enemy movements. Intelligence gathering became increasingly sophisticated, with the use of signal flags, balloons for aerial observation, and more effective communication systems that allowed commanders to coordinate large-scale troop movements with greater accuracy. Medical advancements were another key area of innovation during the Civil War. With a high number of casualties and limited medical knowledge at the time, the war accelerated improvements in battlefield medicine. Innovations such as the triage system, antiseptic practices, and the introduction of field hospitals helped address the overwhelming number of wounded soldiers. Additionally, advancements in prosthetic limbs and other post-injury care were developed to manage the long-term needs of wounded veterans. The introduction of systematic logistics and supply chain management was essential to sustaining armies on both sides. The Union Army's sophisticated system of supply management allowed for the consistent provisioning of troops, while the Confederacy struggled with inefficient systems that often led to shortages of food, weapons, and medical supplies. This logistical superiority contributed significantly to the Union's overall effectiveness on the battlefield. In summary, the Civil War ushered in a new era of military innovation. From advancements in weaponry and transportation to the development of total war strategies and improved medical practices, the conflict reshaped the nature of warfare and influenced future military conflicts. These innovations not only helped define the outcome of the Civil War, but also laid the groundwork for modern military practices in the 20th and 21st centuries. The American Civil War not only shaped the nation during its years of conflict, but also left a lasting impact on the soldiers who fought and the country as a whole in the years that followed. The sheer scale of casualties, injuries, and emotional trauma created a vast population of veterans who faced immense challenges in reintegrating into civilian life. The post-war recovery process was a long and arduous journey, encompassing physical, psychological, and social healing, as well as the effort to address the needs of a war-torn nation. One of the most immediate challenges faced by veterans was the physical toll of the war. With over 620,000 deaths, more than any other war in U.S. history, the need for care for the wounded and disabled was overwhelming. Soldiers who returned home were often burdened with physical injuries, amputations, and illnesses such as tuberculosis, malnutrition, and infections that were widespread in field hospitals. Many veterans faced permanent disabilities, forcing them into lives of poverty, as there were limited resources for rehabilitation and support at the time. In response, the federal government and various organizations began to establish aid systems to provide assistance to disabled veterans and their families. The creation of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau, alongside other charitable and government programs, marked the beginning of a more structured approach to supporting veterans. These efforts focused on providing pensions, medical care, vocational training, and land grants to help veterans transition back into society. However, the process was far from seamless, as many veterans struggled with bureaucratic delays and insufficient resources. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though not formally recognized as such during the Civil War era, was a prevalent issue among soldiers who witnessed the horrors of war. The psychological scars left by combat, along with the loss of comrades and the brutality of battle, created a long-lasting emotional burden. Veterans often suffered from depression, anxiety, and a sense of alienation, as the trauma of war continued to affect their daily lives. Efforts to address these mental health issues were minimal at the time, with the focus primarily on physical healing rather than emotional or psychological recovery. Social reintegration also posed significant difficulties for many veterans. The societal expectations of returning soldiers were to return to a life of productivity, whether through farming, business, or labor. Yet many veterans struggled to adapt to civilian life after such a transformative and destructive experience. The return to a society that had dramatically changed economically, politically, and socially created tensions for former soldiers who had become accustomed to the camaraderie and purpose of military service. For African American veterans, the challenges of reintegration were compounded by the continuation of systemic racism and segregation. Freedmen who fought for the Union were often denied the same recognition and support as their white counterparts. Many faced discrimination in employment, education, and healthcare, forcing them into positions of economic disadvantage and social exclusion. The lack of rights for Black veterans became a focal point for future civil rights activism and political advocacy. The Civil War's impact on families of veterans was equally significant. Widows, orphan children, and families who had lost loved ones were left to cope with grief, poverty, and social stigma. War widows, in particular, were often thrust into difficult financial situations, relying on limited pensions or charitable aid to support their families. Many children of veterans, especially those who lost fathers in the war, faced limited educational opportunities and were forced to contribute to the family's income at an early age. Additionally, the economic displacement caused by the war had long-term effects on the families and communities of veterans. The loss of male breadwinners left many households impoverished, and the rural economies of the South were further disrupted as families struggled to maintain agricultural livelihoods without the labor of freedmen or disabled veterans. This economic strain contributed to prolonged regional disparities, particularly in the southern states, where recovery was slower and inequality persisted. Despite these challenges, the post-war period saw the beginnings of veteran advocacy movements that aimed to ensure greater support for those who had served. Organizations like the Grand Army of the Republic (GR), a Union veterans group, pushed for increased pensions, benefits, and recognition for soldiers. The establishment of programs such as the Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief Act in 1866 provided legal protections to veterans facing debt and other financial burdens. In conclusion, the Civil War's aftermath left an enduring legacy on veterans and their families. The transition back to civilian life was fraught with obstacles, from physical disabilities and mental health challenges to social and economic hardships. Although progress was slow, the period set the stage for future efforts to support and advocate for veterans, shaping modern approaches to veteran care and social welfare. The American Civil War, while primarily fought over the issues of slavery and states' rights, also served as a catalyst for the struggle for civil rights and equality, particularly for African Americans. The war and its aftermath had profound implications for the fight against racial discrimination and the push for a more inclusive society. While the end of the war led to the abolition of slavery and the formal recognition of African American freedom, it did not immediately result in equality or civil rights for all. Instead, the post-war era witnessed an intense battle for equality that continued to shape American society for decades to come. One of the most significant achievements of the Civil War was the emancipation of 4 million enslaved African Americans. With the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, slavery was officially abolished throughout the United States. This marked a monumental victory for the abolitionist movement, as well as for African Americans who had long fought for their freedom. However, emancipation alone did not ensure full civil rights or social equality. Freed African Americans still faced profound legal, social, and economic barriers, particularly in the South, where discriminatory practices and oppressive legislation, such as black codes and Jim Crow laws, sought to maintain white supremacy and control over black populations. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was one of the first major legislative efforts to guarantee civil rights for African Americans. It aimed to provide equal protection under the law, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. However, this act was met with fierce opposition, particularly from southern states that sought to undermine the rights of freedmen. The passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868 further solidified civil rights, ensuring equal protection and due process under the law, yet its enforcement was uneven, with many southern states working to circumvent these protections through discriminatory policies and practices. The Reconstruction period, 1865 to 1877, saw an initial wave of progress for civil rights as African Americans participated in the political process, held public office, and established communities that sought to empower free people. However, the period was also marked by intense backlash from white supremacist groups and Southern resistance to change. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary groups emerged to terrorize black communities, destroy political activism, and undermine Reconstruction efforts. The federal government's inability to fully protect African Americans from violence and systemic discrimination weakened the strides made during Reconstruction, leading to a rollback of civil rights advancements. Despite setbacks during the Reconstruction era, the Civil War laid the groundwork for future civil rights movements. After the withdrawal of federal troops and the end of Reconstruction, African Americans continued to fight for civil rights through activism, legal challenges, and political advocacy. Landmark Supreme Court cases, such as Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, continued to uphold the principle of separate but equal, perpetuating segregation and institutional racism. This decision solidified discriminatory laws and practices across the nation, especially in the South, where African Americans were denied basic rights and subjected to inequality in education, employment, and public services. In the early 20th century, the civil rights movement gained momentum with the rise of leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Booker T. Washington, who advocated for social, economic, and political change. The Great Migration of African Americans to northern cities brought issues of civil rights and racial equality into the national spotlight, especially as communities confronted discrimination in housing, labor, and social institutions. The struggle for voting rights, education, and equality became central to the activism that eventually culminated in the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. Moreover, the legacy of African American soldiers who fought for the Union during the Civil War remained a symbol of resilience and courage in the fight for equality. The contributions of African American soldiers, who demonstrated their patriotism and dedication to the Union cause, challenged prevailing racial prejudices and fueled the argument for civil rights. Despite the hardships and discrimination they faced both during and after the war, these soldiers and their communities continued to push for a more just and equitable society. In summary, the Civil War set the stage for a long and ongoing struggle for civil rights. While it led to the formal end of slavery and the initial recognition of African American freedoms, the fight for equality remained a complex and often difficult journey. Despite setbacks and periods of regression, the foundations laid during and after the Civil War have continued to influence and shape the quest for civil rights in the United States, with future movements building on the sacrifices and achievements of past generations. The American Civil War profoundly influenced the roles and experiences of women, both in the North and the South. Traditionally confined to the private sphere, women played multifaceted roles during the war, serving as nurses, spies, advocates, and caregivers. As men went off to fight, women assumed responsibilities that were crucial to the war effort, reshaping their societal roles and paving the way for future gender roles in American society. Although their contributions were often overlooked or marginalized, women played a vital part in sustaining the war effort and influencing the nation's development in significant ways. One of the most visible roles women played during the Civil War was that of nurses and caregivers. Both Union and Confederate armies relied heavily on women to provide medical care in field hospitals, battlefronts, and even makeshift hospitals closer to home. Notable figures such as Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, gained prominence for her tireless work in providing aid to wounded soldiers. Women like Barton and Dorothea Dix helped organize medical supplies, recruit nurses, and provide emotional support to soldiers in need. Their contributions significantly impacted the survival rates of wounded soldiers and demonstrated women's capabilities in fields once dominated by men. In addition to medical roles, women also took on the duties of managing households and businesses while their male counterparts fought. In the North, women worked in factories producing ammunition, clothing, and weapons, ensuring that the Union armies were well equipped. The entry of women into the industrial workforce marked the beginning of their active participation in the economy, contributing to the war effort through organized labor. In the South, women maintained farms, plantations, and local economies in the absence of male labor, which was essential to keeping Confederate resources flowing, despite resource shortages and blockades. Women also served as spies and intelligence gatherers, helping both the Union and Confederate forces gain crucial information about the enemy. Southern women, in particular, became notorious for espionage, using their access to Southern households and social networks to gather intelligence for the Confederacy. Union women, such as Elizabeth Van Lew and Harriet Tubman, played instrumental roles in intelligence networks and operated secret missions. Harriet Tubman's role in guiding escaped slaves and Union soldiers through the Underground Railroad exemplified how women used their networks to contribute to the Union cause, often risking their own lives in the process. Additionally, women became active in advocacy and humanitarian efforts during the war. Organizations such as the United States Sanitary Commission in the North and Confederate aid societies in the South mobilized women to support soldiers and civilians alike. Women collected donations, prepared care packages, and provided moral support to soldiers and families who had lost loved ones. Their work laid the foundation for modern philanthropy and social welfare, emphasizing the importance of women's involvement in social justice and community services. Despite their crucial contributions, women faced significant societal limitations in the post-war era. Although they demonstrated their abilities in a variety of roles, women were still denied full political rights, particularly the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, would not be ratified until 1920, long after the Civil War had ended. However, the war did set a precedent for women's involvement in civic life, planting seeds for future advocacy and political movements for gender equality. Furthermore, the Civil War also highlighted the intersections of race and gender, particularly for African American women. Enslaved women, who had been the most vulnerable before the war, took on expanded roles during and after the conflict. Many became activists and community leaders, advocating for racial and gender equality. Women like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Ida B. Wells fought not only for the abolition of slavery, but also for the rights of African American women who had been doubly marginalized. In summary, the Civil War was a transformative period for women, as they demonstrated their capabilities in fields traditionally dominated by men. Their contributions during the war expanded their roles beyond the domestic sphere and into areas of medicine, labor, intelligence, and advocacy. Although women were often excluded from formal recognition, the war laid the groundwork for future gender equality movements, highlighting their vital contributions to both the war effort and the broader social evolution of American society. The American Civil War had a profound and lasting impact on the economy of the United States, shaping both the North and the South in ways that would influence the nation's development for generations. The war disrupted established economies, altered trade patterns, and introduced new financial systems that would define modern American economic practices. The North's industrialized economy and the South's agrarian-based economy were fundamentally transformed by the conflict, leading to shifts in labor, infrastructure, and regional power dynamics. In the North, the Civil War accelerated the country's industrialization and economic growth. The war effort demanded massive amounts of resources, including weapons, clothing, transportation, and food supplies. As a result, northern industries boomed, with factories producing unprecedented quantities of goods to supply Union forces. Railroads, steel mills, and textile factories saw rapid expansion to meet the demands of wartime production. This industrial expansion created new opportunities for labor, particularly for immigrant workers and women, who entered the workforce in large numbers to fill labor shortages caused by men leaving to fight in the war. Additionally, the war fostered the rise of modern banking and finance. The Union's need for funding led to the establishment of the first national banking system and the issuance of federal bonds and currency to finance the war effort. The introduction of a centralized banking system, along with the establishment of the national debt, laid the groundwork for a more robust financial infrastructure. This shift not only contributed to the North's economic dominance, but also helped institutionalize a more centralized federal government in managing the nation's economy. In contrast, the South's economy was deeply impacted by the Civil War, as it relied almost entirely on agriculture and slave labor to sustain its economy. The Confederate economy struggled due to resource shortages, blockades imposed by the Union Navy, and the loss of enslaved labor as a critical resource. Cotton, the South's primary cash crop, saw a decline in production due to diminished labor and the destruction of farmland during Union campaigns like General Sherman's March to the Sea. The Confederacy's limited industrial base and lack of infrastructure to support wartime demands ultimately crippled its ability to sustain the war effort. The South's post-war recovery was slow, with the region left in economic devastation. The end of slavery meant the loss of the labor system upon which the Southern economy had been built, leading to a desperate need for new labor and agricultural systems. Sharecropping and the rise of tenant farming became dominant, albeit exploitative, systems that sought to replace the pre-war plantation economy. However, the economic inequality between the North and South persisted, deepening the divide between industrialized prosperity in the North and economic hardship in the agrarian South. The Civil War also laid the foundation for significant changes in federal fiscal policies. The war necessitated taxation reforms and the introduction of income tax, which became permanent after the war's conclusion. This shift in fiscal policy expanded the federal government's role in economic regulation and established the idea of a more interventionist state during times of national crisis. Moreover, the war had lasting effects on labor practices. In both the North and South, the conflict accelerated the decline of indentured servitude and opened the door for more systematic labor systems. In the North, the war introduced the first waves of organized labor movements, seeking better working conditions and pay, while Southern labor remained largely unregulated and subject to exploitative sharecropping arrangements. The post-war economic recovery was a gradual process, but it also set the stage for the rise of a more unified national economy. The North's industrial base helped rebuild the country's infrastructure, with railroads, factories, and banking systems working in tandem to create a stronger, interconnected economy. The South's eventual reindustrialization was slow and marred by systemic inequality, but it contributed to the broader economic diversification of the United States. In summary, the Civil War left an indelible mark on the nation's economy, transforming industrial, financial, and labor systems in both regions. The war accelerated industrialization in the North, centralized financial management, and altered the South's agricultural economy, setting the stage for a more interconnected and modern American economy. Despite the immediate devastation and struggles of recovery, the conflict laid the groundwork for the United States' eventual emergence as a global economic power.